So today I'm talking to Helen Wilson. Hi.
Hi. I'm very well, thank you.
Good. Now we've got our screen sorted out.
Yeah.
So see, I'm still fiddling around. Anyway, Helen, traditional first question is, what do you do?
I care for people. In its
Good
broadest
question.
sense.
Good answer. Yeah. So that sounds quite a broad thing. I know it's more complicated than that, probably, isn't it? More detailed than that. So when you say you care for people, is this for elderly people, young people, or everybody?
I think I care for everybody, and I think it's further reaching than just my profession, obviously, which I'm sure we'll go into, what I do for a living, but within my social and everyday life, that fundamental part of who I am, transgresses across everything, really, in all that I do.
Yeah. It's an interesting point, that is, because again, it's one of those things that, and we'll probably get into this actually, that maybe, I'm sort of jumping the gun maybe, but when you get to sort of like core things that people do, it's not just isolated in one. Well, obviously it's a core thing, but you know what I mean. You sort of think, well, I do whatever, but you'll see that mirrored across just about everything that people do, if you see what I mean. Because again, I suppose in a way, I've done a lot of teaching, so whatever I end up doing, I sort of end up teaching it weirdly. So it's a similar, this is
it is a similar thing. I think what happens quite often, and I think your first question is a great question, that people's automatic answer is to quite often to respond with what they do for a profession, for a living, make money. And that doesn't necessarily reflect who they are or what it is that they do in life.
No.
So I guess that's why I use the answer that I do.
Yes.
Because it's just it's more. And I think you're right. I think that perhaps somebody who is a teacher would say, well, I like to teach, and that's very broad as well.
Yes, exactly. Because obviously it's a bit of a trick question, that first one. It's kind of sort of an opening gambit.
I obviously didn't quite fall for it then.
No. It's a sort of an opening gambit. Because obviously some people don't answer it in that way at all, and other people do. But obviously as it starts to broaden out, you realise that there are lots of other things going on, and that opening question leads to other things. So let's just look at the sort of caring thing. When did you realise that that's really part of how you operated?
Genuinely, when I was young, really very young, I mean, goodness me, you could always say it stems back to how I would play with dolls, or in my relationships with friendships, that would always come through. I just always cared, and always cared for people. I always wanted to help people. I always wanted to, I guess, contribute to somebody else in some kind of way, perhaps for different reasons over the years. But no, as a child, I just enjoyed being caring, and I guess I used to think of it as helping people to feel better. And I would say that still applies today. It's about helping people feel better in the broadest sense, about themselves, about their situation, about how they manage something, about how they develop. And that all comes into the realms of caring,
Mm.
whether it be for me in my profession as a nurse, whether it be for me in my sort of vocation, unpaid vocation, helping people at the end of their lives as a sole midwife, whether it's within the groups and societies that I belong to, that I help people to find themselves within that and paths that they want to take. To me, that it is all caring. And it's not, to be fair, we say people, but it isn't just people. It's everything, you know, that it permeates into my care for my environment, my care for my animals, my care for, well, the way I prepare my food.
Yes.
Everything, just everything.
Yes.
It's a conscious thing. It's a conscious thing. I think perhaps when I was young, I was doing it fairly unconsciously, but over the last decade, that more holistic way of looking at it has been done very, very consciously.
See, there are certain sort of themes that come up in this, when I'm talking to people. One of them is how early you realise that you do what you do, and okay, some of that, people could just say, well, that's sort of self-fulfilling. You could look back and project what you do, but actually, it's pretty obvious that people who are involved in like arts are doing arty things quite early on. It might not be in the way that you would go like, oh, so-and-so was a magnificent, at drawing when they were 3. It's not necessarily that. It's that sort of inclination towards something, which is, again, what you're saying, that you found yourself in that sort of place, sort of caring for people early on. And it permeates the way that you see.
Yeah. I also see it. It's interesting you use the word creative people, but to care is you have to be creative within that.
You do. Yes, that's a very good point, actually.
So I would very much say that I was a creative person because I create situations and help to create outcomes, as well as just being generally creative in the traditional senses as well. But,
so was that the thing that you got into first, was nursing?
No, I started nursing when I was almost 19. I did have a dalliance with being at college with the intention of doing something completely else. And that would have been a really bad idea. But weirdly enough, I ended up kind of doing it. I ended up doing it, but within my professional life. So I actually went to college to study business. And, I just used to be called a National Diploma in Business Studies. And I had this notion of becoming an advertising accounts executive because I liked the idea of it being creative and I could earn some money. But actually, I found it really quite tedious and boring and didn't even really last the year out and skived off a lot. But, ultimately, I ended up running businesses, managing businesses that were within the social care sector and field, for decades, really. So, yeah. So I guess I came back to it in some kind of way.
Yeah. Because obviously, again, this is another little thing that I think often gets missed out, particularly with like creative people, is the fact that you have to make some money, and the idea of having some business skill, the ability to just basic entrepreneurial way of looking at things, where I've got this thing I've got over here that somebody would be interested in buying. I mean, that's an important thing. Otherwise nothing happens, does it?
No, it was, and it's funny because when I got to the end of that year and I thought, well, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? I realised that the thing that I guess my grandmother, I remember her saying it, that she always predicted I would be, was to be a nurse. She always said, everybody in our family, they're either nurses, teachers, or they're businessmen, and that's
all right.
that was it. But she always felt that I would be a nurse. She indeed was a nurse, and she was a huge influence upon my life. You know, she hadn't been a nurse for many years, but that's how she'd started out in the 1920s, until she met, you know, my grandfather. And I thought, you know, yeah, absolutely. I think
Here's
you know,
here's
indeed,
here's a thing.
this is it. Yeah, and I thought it was really interesting. And then I had just before I was about to be interviewed for my student nursing application, I had a horrific motorbike accident.
Oh.
And literally 3 days before the interview, and was not in a good situation. I'd broken my arm. I had a gloving injury to my foot, so I kind of, it's almost like when you peel a glove off, it comes off backwards. I did that to my foot, and was in quite a bad state for that. But 3 weeks later, I had been discharged from hospital, and they'd kindly rearranged my interview. So I went to my interview with an elbow crutch in one arm and a crutch on the other, on my leg in plaster, and sat in front of these. God, remember, this was the 1980s, when it was still old school of nursing, type nursing.
Yeah.
And there was these 3 mature clinical nurse tutors interviewing me, and their first words were, "Well, you really do want to be a nurse, don't you?"
And that's what I was going to say. Yeah.
And so yes, and that's really where my career began, and I've never left it. You know, there's been periods when I've not worked, or that I, you know, when I was raising children, or in a bit of a dance, but I've completely remained for almost 40 years now.
It's amazing. That's an amazing story. Again, that if you imagine interviewing people and somebody, I've often thought about this when I've taught kids. I thought, if I'd seen myself, you know, turn up for lessons, what would I have thought? You know, if one of these kids was just like me, and I would have thought, God, this guy's keen. Because there's certain things that you sort of realise you did, but you know, I suppose you never thought anything about it. It's just the fact that you had to go.
Oh, well, yeah, right? I went there, and I needed to do it, and I wanted to do it, and yes. I did do it, and I started doing it. And I remember when I got to my very first ward, with probably the strictest ward sister I have ever met in all my years, who I'm sure is no longer with us, but I remember being on those first few weeks in the ward, and her getting really quite frustrated with me.
Oh, okay, it's okay.
Well, hey, well, yeah, sorry.
It's all right. You're not the first person to have done this.
That wasn't actually me. That was my kind dog.
Oh, it was your dog. I was going to say, it's normally a cat that comes in.
And he's just currently trying to get in onto the picture, and he's tried to get on. I do apologise. He does feel like he has to get in on every Zoom call that I get into. And what's his name? This is Doogie. So I think what we might do here is we might abandon me trying to have it set up hands-free.
Yeah, no, just
it's probably the best thing.
No, that's it. It's cool. It's good.
So this is Doogie, who I also care for, who cares for me intensely.
Yeah, he looks like he does.
Yeah.
So this you were saying about the strict ward sister who got frustrated with you just before the cat.
Well, the dog decided he was going to destroy the setup. Yeah, absolutely. So this sister, you know, she was getting frustrated with me because, you know, I was young. I was 18. I just left home. I was living in the nurses' home, and it was so much fun. You know, we were all young student nurses, and there was parties and
I can imagine
all kinds of, you know, fun and shenanigans, really. And I think she was not convinced that I would make it as a nurse.
Right.
You know? And somebody passed away when we were on the ward, and she said she got me, because it was all, you know, it was, you know, student nurse Helen, you need to come with me. If you're going to be a nurse, you need to get death sorted out in your mind.
Right.
And that was my very first direct encounter with somebody challenging me, I suppose, about our mortality and the reality of our death, and of the work that I was going to do in my career. And well, clearly the experience has stayed with me for the whole of my
Yes.
life. And, you know, when she went in, she, for as strict as she was, she dealt with that person with the greatest of dignity and just love and care in the way that we washed them and we changed them and we made them comfortable before we then did the final last offices, which is something that we don't really do, certainly not in care homes in this way anymore. But and it embedded something really quite deep within me about the way that I was then going to continue to nurse for the rest of my career, and my interest in people at the end of their life and the care that they need.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's amazing. Because I was going to say to you, you know, about the thing of the, you know, as it would have been the matron type of characters, you know, in the past, which you don't, I don't know whether you see that anymore now. I don't see much evidence of it, but
few and far between. And unfortunately, I perhaps when I was last in that particular kind of role, it was probably more your matron kind of person, I guess.
but they were the, well, I'm only looking at it from the outside, but they always seem to be the thing that pulled everything together. They were the sort of central, like a sort of a loci of, you know, you knew somebody was in control somehow, whether that was true or not, but it always seemed that way.
I think that people do, and they reintroduced, the matrons were phased out of hospitals and they're now reintroduced as modern matrons.
Yeah, reintroduced.
You know, as that. And I think it's because people see it for that exact reason. It provides a centre point of somebody that they can go to where they feel that they can trust, who is going to get something done. If it isn't quite right, who will listen to them and will hear and understand those things. You see that outside of hospitals, in care homes as well. I think that management has changed. The way that we manage people has changed hugely, certainly over the last 10 years, if not longer. And that direct style of leadership is less common, and we work in a more collaborative way, which has its pros and cons. And I think it's also because of the way that generations have changed. You know, there's a lot about Generation X, you know, at the moment, in the boomers, you know, and I am agent, you know, the forgotten generation, and that's the way that we kind of like it to be. You know, those who were brought up to be who are resilient and could just get on with things. But now we're the older generation. We are now the older ones in that generation and the leaders. And actually, we're having to, in a work setting, be working with and managing people who come from what people like to term the millennial or the Gen Z. I'm only just learning about some of these things.
Oh God, yeah, I know. I'm not quite up to speed on all that myself, but
no, I'm not too. I mean, you know, and I'm you know, I take a little bit of it with a pinch of salt and a little bit broadly, but it is a fair point, because I think certainly younger generations just wouldn't tolerate being managed in that way and being questioned or told what to do. You know, we would have just, you know, our generation, we'd have just gone, all right, the boss has got to do it. We need to do it.
Yeah, but as you said, the pros and cons, aren't there, to both of those.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely.
You know, sometimes you're in establishments where you can't negotiate certain things; they have just to be done. Somebody has to say.
Yeah,
I'd certainly say that. Obviously, the army is one of them, but I would also say at some points, you know, surely hospitals are another one where you can't just, you know, things have to be done. Somebody's got to take some sort of leadership, haven't they?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, it's more difficult for me to talk about how things have been over the years within the hospital ward environment, because the majority of my career has been spent outside of that. So whilst
Mm.
I've returned to work into the NHS now, 25 years of that was actually working within the care home sector,
Mm.
which is a little bit different.
So here's an interesting thing. Okay, so care homes, they would be I would have thought, a very different environment anyway, because you get to know people in a particular way, don't you?
Well, you generally get to know people at the latter end. If you're in older people, again, it depends on the services that you're in, but you're looking after people by and large in the longer term, and quite often for the remainder of what is their life, unless you happen to work in a rehab or a respite type setting. But the majority of people tend to be older, and their needs are quite broad and can be quite complex. Sometimes they can provide their own challenges for them. But you come to know them really, really well, and their families, and that is we quite often say, we like to say it is their home, because it can never really be what that they would feel was their home, but it is their home for now.
Yes. Now, what about their stories?
Oh, goodness.
The stories of the people, because again, that is something that you probably would get some sort of access to that you would not get in a hospital, because obviously, I don't know, what is the situation? Do you
it can really, really vary. Some people you get to find out so much about who they are and their life that they live, and some extraordinary things, which goodness me, I've looked after over the years people who fought in the war, who were dam busters.
Well, that's amazing, because that just recently was the anniversary of the dam busters raid.
Absolutely. People who'd served it, well, even
it was last month actually.
I'd even looked after people who'd served in the First World War, because they've been around so long. But all the way through, really. And interestingly, some of them, certainly during the Second War, who'd been around in the raids, with bombings, who had dementia, who I guess had what we would now call a post-traumatic stress, but back then it wasn't something that was particularly well known, who would suddenly get flashbacks, would perceive themselves to be in that battle situation, and have pinned members of staff and colleagues up against the wall, trying to strangle, who just couldn't, in their mind, this was the enemy that they were confronting. Which was distressing for them. It was distressing for the members of staff. It was a really sad situation. So you get to see some of the more difficult and sad things. I've met people who've won awards in the Eisteddfod. I've looked after, oh goodness sake, everybody from every profession and every walk of life, with just about every condition that I can think of in the long term. People who've been sharp as a needle when they're 104, to really sad situations where I've looked after people in their 40s who have got an early onset dementia, and it's been very distressing, who've got children who are in their 20s.
Interesting. God, it's incredible, isn't it?
It's never dull being a nurse.
No. So a couple of points here, because obviously this is something I find intriguing, and you would have, because of what you've just said about your experiences there. It's obviously about consciousness, how we see the world, and obviously this is me getting people to talk on this podcast is actually, partly to do with this, and because it's to do with creative people and how you can sort of see things about creativity and the way they see the world, and how people see the world so differently to one another and all the rest of it. And you start to think, consciousness is a sort of a slippery fish, really, isn't it? And
it's a very, consciousness is an interesting concept.
yes.
Really, and I'm going to use the word concept because
Yes.
there are a number of ways that you can explore that, and experience it as well, whether that be the consciousness of presence in the current time and place and the awareness of that. But then when you bring into the mix somebody who's living with dementia, to most people's eyes, their present is not true. But to the person who's living with dementia,
Exactly.
it is exactly true, and it is exactly as it is. And we don't work with people to try to change their thinking into believing that they are in what my perception of my reality is, but we will meet them in theirs and walk with them. And especially if it's distressing, then we might take them on a bit of a walk of a journey through where they're at that time, where that's coming from, trying to grasp, where some of their distress may be coming from, and use a number of techniques to try and help to reduce those levels of agitation, anxiety, and sometimes, quite distressed behaviours, because, they just know that they're supposed to be doing something. Quite often it's, around 5 o'clock when people would go home, they say, but my mama's going to be cooking for me. She's going to come and get me. I need to get the bus. Sometimes it's just about moving around a lot, and getting very worn out and tired, but not being sure about why. And we will just walk with them, meet with them, talk to them, try to divert them, and then help them to, where we can, to break that loop so they find themselves in a more settled position and situation. But it doesn't always work. But what we don't do is tell them that they're wrong.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So I had an experience with somebody who was, dying of cancer, and they would go off on some extraordinary journey, because obviously they're on a lot of diamorphine and stuff. And very, very soon you realised you couldn't just go, no, you're not there, you're here. You'd have to say, they'd say they were on a boat, and you'd say, oh, isn't that wonderful? And then, you'd be on the boat with them. And you suddenly realise that really, in a strange sort of way, that tells you quite a lot about human communication on any level.
Yeah.
Strangely. And it really gave me a little bit of an insight into things like, obviously because I'm involved in music, songwriting is the same thing that you're trying to do within a song, is to, for people to inhabit this world that you're in, but they want to be in it as well, type of thing. So there's lots of things you can sort of think, this is not actually that, because we just think, oh, that's, that's not real. But it's like, well, in a way, everything's like that. No, it sounds a bit weird, but you know what I think you know.
No, but yeah, it's like, if somebody's, in a well, we think that they're in a confused state. There is a little bit of me that sits there quite often and regularly, whether it be with dementia or people at end of life, or in, post-anesthetic, whatever reason, who are in a different reality to me. It is, I think, well, how do I know? How do I really know? How do I know?
Exactly. Exactly.
And, and if they're in a happy place,
yes,
brilliant.
Yes,
You know, maybe I'll go
exactly.
and join them if they're on a beach. You know, maybe I should go and join them there. Let's see you join it.
Exactly.
That's quite good.
Now,
You know,
I'm going to throw a wide ball in here, because obviously a lot of things, like when you look at people and they've had some sort of spiritual experience, or religious experience, a lot of people will turn around and think, well, there's something wrong with them. But again, you sort of go, well, actually, maybe a lot of the great ideas that we've had over millennia come from people who've had, they're inhabiting space that most of us aren't in. That doesn't mean to say, it might be the space, you see what I'm saying?
I do.
And I'm just wondering how much in sort of modern society, maybe there's a little bit of a change coming, because I've noticed some people talking differently about this. But instead of just disregarding stuff, people's experiences, because it doesn't match to normality, that we should just start looking at it and thinking, well, this is an interesting state of consciousness, and obviously something that we might have taken more notice of at one point in time, because it sort of opens the doorway to something else in our thinking.
Yeah.
I don't know, what's the sort of, maybe in care homes, what's the sort of thing that goes, is there a sort of an undercurrent of that, instead of it just being sort of written off, people are not well? But I mean, if you're already in it, meeting,
you mean so sort of when people are, what do you mean when they're well? I mean, are you talking about when people are well and just in a different reality, or when people are dying? Because when people are dying, that's a different thing again.
Yes.
And
that
just
is an interesting point. That is
just,
a very interesting place.
I don't know any. I mean, pretty much every nurse that I know will recount experiences of people saying suddenly unusual and strange things when they're not very well. Quite often they'll say, oh, Fred is there, or their husband will appear to them, or a loved one. Sometimes they will see children, lots of different things, which people quite often put down, to being hallucinations, or I remember somebody telling me once about, sort of when I'd been at work, and I'd said, before I went off on the shift, I'd said, oh, do you know what? They're not right. I don't know why they're not right, but they're not right. There's something going on. Went off, and then obviously overnight they deteriorated quite significantly. But they were talking about, somebody being there at the end, and they were coming for them, and over and above, and then they died, and quite unexpected. I guess there's all kinds of physiological reasons, which all going to do with oxygen and saturation levels and whatever.
But you can put everything down to that, and there's a chemical reason for why somebody might be, a better creative person.
But I've always, one of the things I always notice when people are in those very last stages, when they're dying, our human bodies are really well equipped. They're designed to die, and the way that our body shuts down, it knows what it's doing.
Yes. Well, funny you should say that, because my mother used to tell a story about her first husband who died, and she went to see him in hospital. And he actually said something very similar to that. He said, oh, that man over there has played some beautiful music. She looked over and there was no one there. And she thought, okay. And of course he died shortly after. But she took that as a signal that, something was happening.
I think that's what it is. These are signals that something is happening, whether they are. Did it really happen, or does it know? Well, I'm afraid we don't know this side of life.
No,
but I think for every single person, it appears and it happens in a different way. I know certainly when I had my own little nearish death experience, I found mine interesting, but also slightly disappointing, but actually incredibly comforting. And then when I'm back here, you know, I think I've said, you know, I don't hold any fears of death at
No.
all anymore.
Well, I
I
had
mean, I
something
did,
very similar as well.
even
I
though
was
I've
having
worked in
that.
death a long time, I've never, you know, even though I've worked around death and looking after the
Yeah.
dying, that did not mean that I was not afraid to die. I was
No.
for a long time.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. I think when you have a bit of a close shave.
Yeah.
We
can put it that way, close shave, yeah.
Yeah. You sort of, you know, you have an experience and you think, well, that was peculiar. And as you say, you could rationalize why you see things and all the rest of it. But strangely, and also it does tell you this is a close event, right? But then when you reflect on it later, there is something comforting about it. Strangely, I don't know if it's like that for everyone. It was like that for me, but
I think there's definitely a comfort in it. Maybe it is that sense of affirmation that there is something that isn't awful.
Yes,
that comes, you know.
Natural, I think, is quite a nice word as well.
Yeah, you know,
it's not like it's something that's not supposed to happen, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, but it makes you reflect upon just mortality, really, and that
Yes,
it is going to happen, and therefore, you know, you come back and you live your life in a completely different way. You know, you just, you know, you realize that we spend so much of our time, many people, not all, but many people spend a lot of their time worrying about what is going to happen and what is coming next and what if, instead of getting on and just embracing and loving every part of life and just seeing the richness of it all and the presence of it all and the diversity in it all. I could never be bored. Life is everything, you know, in many ways, and it's all now.
Yes, and I think that's an interesting point, because that's something that seems to be quite common with that experience when people sort of come back. It's not just a case of think, oh, that was, you know, I better make the most of it. It's not even that, is it? It's sort of there's a richness to things that maybe wasn't there like that before, because you just start to realise that you've missed something. Well, I felt like that, you know. You start thinking,
I think and I guess that although when that occurred, I'd already, you know, done some training in end of life care and in this thing, you know, I've mentioned it called soul midwifery. It kind of changed the way that I approach things, but also the way that I work. You know, I started this out by saying, well, I care about people. So the most useful gift that I can do with that gift that's been given to me of not being afraid and of experiencing it and the knowledge is to share that with other people, to allow people their opportunities to talk about, to ask the questions that they really want to ask, or things that they're not sure about that they can't ask anywhere else. Doesn't matter what it is, from the really small to the quite extreme and gory, if they really want to. If any of that discussion can help somebody to go a little bit further in coming to terms with that life is, you know, that our life inside of these bodies is finite, and that they can meet death with a little less fear and a bit more confidence as they potentially, you know, find out about it, then that is what I choose to try and do. But my experience is that when people are dying, all those things that they were worried about, that they thought they'd be frightened of, don't happen. They don't happen. No. I can't think of anybody who has died that I've nursed that has died, who died screaming, I don't want to die, I'm terrified, I don't want to die, I don't want this to happen. They may have gone through that experience earlier on in the process.
Yes.
But when it comes to it,
Yes.
to the natural process of things,
yeah. I've heard
have an
that
acceptance
as well.
with that.
Yeah. And maybe like when people get a diagnosis that there's a sort of it's a terminal situation, that they'll have that problem where everything starts to fall apart. Sort of psychologically, because obviously what we look at as our structure of our life and everything is pinned up with things that we think are there, but of course they're not really there, are they?
They're really not,
No, exactly. And again, this is one of the things I do a lot with sort of creative processes, about questioning things that we assume to be, we believe in, or we think that we're right, and we're questioning, what happens if we're wrong, and what happens if this thing is not relevant, and because it changes. Again, all these things change the way we think in a it's like a ripple effect, isn't it? So I'm always intrigued by that. And again, once, as you say, the body knows how to die, just in the same way as the body knows how to birth.
People, I think quite often people say, well, do you think that happens when it's something that's really traumatic? What happens when, I talk about seeing things as elements leaving the body, they say, well, what happens if suddenly somebody has an accident and they die really quickly or instantaneously? Well, that's a little bit harder for me to speak in an objective way about, because I haven't been able to have the conversations with people, about that experience, but they happen very quickly. So I don't know. In that part, I don't know so well, but I do think that perhaps we still go through the same mental and internal process, but really, really quickly, just, at a speed that we don't really understand.
This is interesting thing about time, isn't it? Because, you often get people talking about, they've had an accident and, they see their life sort of flash before them. I mean, I had a car crash which was similar to that, where suddenly you saw a lot of things very, very quickly. a lot of stuff.
It's like, it's like the whole thing, oh my God.
Yeah, and the other thing is,
it just pops out your mouth.
Time slowing down. When you see the thing happening in slow motion, as you're experiencing it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's something I've experienced, and you've heard people talk about that. And you think, well, there's something very odd going on here in the processes of how we experience the world, and again, there are events that don't happen very often. Well, they do happen, but that you don't hear of them. You don't hear of those things much. And again, a lot of this stuff has become a little bit taboo, hasn't it, in society? We don't like to talk.
It's the same. People don't like to talk about. People like to avoid it. I think there is a turn and a change and a better acceptance. And also,
I think things have changed a bit. Yeah, I do. I think there are certain things that have changed. I mean, if maybe even 10 years ago. Certain things were not.
Definitely.
Yeah.
There were just things people just didn't. I mean, I just think people just didn't like the subject to be spoken about, but that seems to have changed. And I think, we quite often berate social media or the internet, but I actually think that it's gone a fair way. Channels like YouTube, with oh my god, the range of things that you can look at, morticians talk about their work and they do, and showing things, you right down to, I don't know, you can even see how somebody, when it sounds a bit gruesome, but how somebody, when the how a body decomposes. There are
Yeah,
actual
yeah,
footage about
yeah,
about that. People becoming educated about what the regulations and rules are around how you're, people say, do you have to get buried in does it have to be a coffin? It's like, no, because there's actually no rules about it. You just have to be covered by a sheet. You don't
yes,
actually have to be in anything.
yeah,
Just if you're being carried through public, you have to be buried in at least, you need to be in at least a sheet, or but it doesn't have to be a coffin. It can be made of all kinds of things. As just about, you see, 5 years ago, but most people, that would be a revelation to.
yes, yes, it would have been. Yeah,
10
totally.
years ago, willow coffins would have been a bit more, 15 years ago, willow coffins would have been a little bit more out of the ordinary.
Yeah,
But now
absolutely.
cardboard boxes, which are decorated, willow coffins are things that everybody just knows about. That sense of the ecology as well, and
Yes,
how even how you choose to have your corporal remains, interred, whether they're interred in the ground, whether they are, I mean, blasted off, cremated and blasted off into space, or even, liquefied,
yeah,
goodness.
yes, I know, it's incredible. And again, I think that, obviously a lot of that stuff comes from there's obviously a lot of religious stuff to do with
Yeah,
how you dealt with bodies and things. And
yeah,
some of that, I'm not saying that's bad, because some of that was very good, because it was a sort of an honouring of the life and all the rest of it. But if we can just get rid of the stuff that's not, the things that sort of accrue with a way of thinking. And I think that's sort of happened now, because obviously a lot of people, people have a different way of thinking, until, of course, they get close to the point where they're actually considering what happens to them or a loved one. And then people start to wonder,
yeah.
you can't just get rid of, Auntie Maud or whatever. There needs to be some sort of, they'll use it as closure or whatever.
You need a
But
plan. You need a plan. You need you need a plan. You need to.
you do.
There's nothing more distressing, genuinely, for a family member, somebody who loves you, having to decide or ask or answer quickly, what would your mom, dad, brothers, sisters, whatever, whoever it is, what would they want? What would they like? Did they want to be buried? Did they want to be cremated? Were there any wishes? Would they want an input? To put somebody in that position, to me, is so awfully hard. And it doesn't really take, well, actually, that's not fair. I was going to say, it doesn't take much to just write down what you would like and your wishes, which is easy to say and do if you have considered and accepted the fact that you are indeed going to die.
Exactly. Just, I think the other point, because you meant, we touched on this about the fact if you have a bit of a brush with death,
Yep.
it's great. It's a great teacher, and I would also think is, from that point of view, it's an extraordinary sort of creative aspect, and you see this particularly in things like, well, Buddhism particularly, I would say, but I would say in other ways of thinking, certain South American religions and African religions, where death is this incredibly creative aspect. And of course, we don't like to sort of consider that. But I think now we're beginning to see that, because nothing can live without something dying. Because you wouldn't have anything, you wouldn't have any earth if nothing died. I mean, it's one of those things that we have to sort of
It's a
get our head
necessary
around.
recycling. In a
Yes.
sense, it's a necessary, and not really. It's it is sacred. It is a sacred recycling, and I think if people start to think about it in those terms, that you can do it in a really conscious way. Having it's not even just a case. I mean, it's a good start to put down on paper what you would like. How would you like that to be? Begin when you're young, for goodness sakes, because you don't know. But as soon as you can, start to write down what you would like, or talk about it, or let family members know. People, my children, whether they liked it or not, really, they definitely know what I currently want and what I wouldn't want. So they've got that. They've got that. I've taken that off their mind. That isn't something that they have to worry about. These things are living. Plans change. They change with your thinking and your thoughts. But if you keep updating that plan that you've got for your life and for the end of your life, what your thoughts and your wishes are, if you do pass away, then at least you've got the very last, something down that is what you were thinking the last time that you wrote it. Might not be exact, you might not be.
No, it might not be completely up to date, but at least they'll have an idea.
But it'll be pretty close, won't it? And it's also, but that's a creative process in itself, isn't it? Really,
it is. It is. Of course, it is. This is the point about this. You see, because with so it's about creativity, but actually, it's just life, isn't it? And it's also about you thinking for yourself and not just following what somebody else has told you. I mean, obviously, a lot of what we do is, again, it's recycled of what we've picked out from the world. But your own experiences of life, I mean, they're the things that really are important, really.
And this is it. I like the notion of the recycling. So obviously for me, my thinking is that I am not just a corporeal body. I have additional spiritual thinking within that. But when I'm just thinking about my corporeal body side of that, when I die, I found, I have when I moved to where I live now, I took a walk and I found an acorn from under a tree. It was just starting to sprout, so I brought it home with me and I planted it into a Pepsi Max can, to be exact, and photographed it, Facebooked it, because I'm Helen and I Facebook everything. So, literally, it is. My Facebook is my journal of my life. It is the things in those. It's not everything. It's not fully encompassing, but it's snapshots throughout my daily life. My life. So I watched it grow and develop and have documented that, and it is now sitting in a pot in the garden about 18 inches high, and I am loving it and nurturing it and learning as much as I can about how you don't lose your oak tree because if you leave it in a small pot, it's no good. There's things you have to do, because the whole intention of this is that will be the tree that is planted either on top of me, or my ashes or whatever. At the moment I currently wish to be buried, but I will rot, deteriorate, and I will feed the tree, and I will in some level become the tree,
that oak tree. Yeah, exactly.
I will become that oak tree.
Yeah, that's a wonderful thought.
And that's, I just like that I'm food for tree, and then I become the tree and the essence of the tree. Which will in itself constantly each year regenerate, and live long time, and eventually die, and then refeed, and then so you never really die in that sense.
No, that's a that's a lovely thought, isn't it? And in a way, what's really nice about it is because you're actually dealing with that now.
Yes.
And it's part of your sort of
decent sized tree for it to have a chance to do that.
Yeah, exactly.
It needs to be nurtured. So I am caring.
That's a brilliant thing to finish. We've been talking for an hour, actually.
Goodness me.
Isn't that cool? That's wonderful.
I know. And we've mostly just talked about death, but there we go.
No, that's cool. I quite like that. That's great. Well, that was wonderful. There's lots of other things we didn't get onto, but let's maybe save that for another time.
Absolutely.
And that was really good. And I think you know, there's a lot of people, because I have lots of little things that I'm involved with, and this type of conversation, I think, is something that a lot of people would find very interesting, because again, it's not the sort of conversation they could normally have.
No,
they,
and it is the way that I see things, and based on my experiences, it might not be it might be helpful, but it might lead them off on a journey to explore and find what their thoughts and views are, and help in some kind of way.
Yes, yeah. And as I say, I've always thought this sort of thing is a real sort of a opening for sort of creative thinking, because it stops you realise that there is a limit to yourself, because otherwise we're just always thinking that we can just carry on planning, which is good to plan, but it's good to know that you can't just wait. Some things need to be done today, because because you can't just wait for some period of time in the future, because you may never get to do that thing.
Yeah, there's an old cliche, so don't put off till tomorrow what can be done, can be done today. It is true,
it is absolutely true.
Do I live that? No, probably not.
No, but
as much as I'd like to,
yeah, that's good. Anyway, that's lovely. Thanks ever so much. Really nice chat.
Thank you.
And
it's been a pleasure.
No, it's been really good. And speak soon.
Speak soon. Take care.
Bye.